Hello and welcome to the Forestry Briefing, Forestry Journal's monthly roundup of the latest news and headlines from the world of forestry. I'm editor of Forestry Journal, John McNee. I'm joined by Deputy Editor Jack Haugh. We are in the beautiful surroundings of Broadmeadows Estate today in the Scottish borders. And today's episode is brought to you by Husqvarna, a name well known to everyone in the industry who've kindly agreed to sponsor today's episode. And we'll put a link to their website in the description so you can keep up to date with their latest products. So where are we going to start today, Jack? I've actually been off on holiday for a little bit, so I'm not too au fait with the latest that has been going on. Where do you think, what's the top story that's worth getting people's attention?
That's a good way just to land me in it. I think I've been on holiday, it's nothing to do with me, everything that's gone wrong in the last few weeks, that's all you, Jack, basically.
Yep.
So yeah, I think that it's been quite an interesting few weeks, quite a busy few weeks as it tends to be. We're obviously still reeling, or reeling's maybe not the right word, but we're still feeling the after effects of the RSC report in forestry in terms of subsidy support for coniferous woodlands, and I think that takes us probably onto the main story, one of the big stories from the last few weeks, and that actually concerns a coniferous woodland, and not just that, it concerns a Sitka spruce plantation that might be being planted in the Scottish borders, probably not too far from where we are relatively. So long story short, it's been approved by Scottish Forestry. A 700 hectare site has been approved. That's actually in the surrounding area of quite a famous countryside walk, the Buchan Way. Now that's obviously after John Buchan, the very famous influential figure in Scotland, who a lot of people know, but I can't say I know a huge amount about him, which you probably tell from here. But anyway, quite an influential figure anyway. So long story short, this has been approved, but what we've seen in the past few weeks is a local group of, I guess they'd call themselves concerned residents, I guess they'd call themselves concerned citizens, actually not just opposing or not just trying to oppose this plantation, but going so far as to try and raise money to take it to the court in Edinburgh to actually block the plantation from being approved, which is quite significant, quite dramatic. And
Yeah, now what is their opposition? What points do they raise against it? Do we know?
Yeah, well, I mean, the funny thing is this actually follows a lot of trends of a lot of stories about Sitka spruce, and I'm just going to speak in broad terms about what they have said, what their opposition is based around, but it's usually they've argued that Scottish Forestry didn't do the correct environmental impact assessments. They've argued that Scottish Forestry ignored advice and warnings from Nature Scotland is one of the claims. Scottish Forestry, I should say, don't agree to that, but that's one thing they've put. And they just argue, like a lot of people would argue with Sitka spruce, that it's not environmentally beneficial to the area. It's really just going to be a sort of deep dark monoculture that's going to bring no biodiversity benefits. And interestingly enough, the people who are opposing this actually mentioned that RSC report and mentioned the conclusions they came to insofar as monocultures, Sitka spruce plantation, they didn't mention that particularly, but monocultures don't bring the biodiversity benefit which we want to see. So instead, and this won't surprise many people in forestry, instead they'd rather it was either native species, but I think more specifically native broadleaves that were planted here now. It's quite interesting, and as I say, this might not necessarily be nothing new to a lot of people in forestry. What probably is new is that potential court challenge which may happen. And in the last we saw they'd raised £10,000 of £35,000 they were looking to raise, so they are kind of getting towards that total. But I think this kind of plays into the ongoing discussion and kind of maybe thinking, just taking a step back and thinking kind of broader terms about Sitka, about the future of Sitka in Scotland and the wider UK. And it's such an important crop, such an important species for the timber trade in Scotland and the wider UK, but it wouldn't be fair to say there aren't some in forestry, some within the industry themselves who think maybe we shouldn't be reliant on it as a species. However, and maybe this point I'll maybe just go in there, we see so many things about Sitka which actually go against that caricature, and I think it's very easy to have a caricature of Sitka. Sometimes the way it's been planted probably makes that the case, when you do see it kind of with that image you have. But we have this image and this caricature of Sitka as being, it just kills everything, there's no biodiversity, nothing, doesn't bring anything to the local area.
And that's not always the case.
No, that's not always the case, and there's been a lot of research done, particularly by industry, independent research done, which would suggest that the Sitka spruce, when planted correctly, when managed correctly, actually does have its biodiversity benefits. But It's actually one story from this week, and I'm going to absolutely butcher the name here, so I might not even attempt it, but there's a story that, again, suggests that's not the case, and it comes from people who are... Let me get my papers here. It comes from people who are restoring the rainforest in Scotland, and what they actually discovered was a rare form of fungus. Again, I'm not going to butcher the name, it's on the website if you want to read about it. But they discovered a rare form of fungus that has a symbiotic relationship with Sitka spruce and only grows in Sitka spruce. So, in other words, it's biodiversity that only exists because of non-native Sitka spruce. Now, this is just the second time it's been found in the UK, this particular form of fungus. I think it's the first time it's been found in Scotland, and such has been this discovery, it even has the people who are behind the rainforest restoration taking a step back and thinking, oh, maybe we need to reconsider some things. Maybe, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but I think the kind of reading I took from it was maybe it's not always necessarily the right case to just have this blanket, get rid of all Sitka spruce and see from there. But
do we think a rare fungus is going to change people's minds as to where they fall on the pro-con Sitka spruce debate?
Probably not, but what it probably does give people in forestry who want to argue the case for Sitka spruce is just another string to that bow. And as I say, there are many discussions to be had about the future of Sitka. Obviously we have the potential, we've seen it spreading in parts of the UK, still not in Scotland yet, other than the two cases that have been found, but people do have those concerns if that were to become more widespread. So there is discussions to be had, but sorry, bottom line, to go back to your point, is it going to change the hearts and minds of people? Is it going to change the hearts and minds of the people who oppose the Buchan Way plantation? Probably not. But it gives...
Yeah, we have seen some pretty entrenched thinking, not just here, but in Ireland and places where people are very, very, very much dead set against new Sitka plantations, and I don't think we'll be dissuaded from that opinion.
No, and I think that's something which is difficult to come. As I say, this fungus thing, it's a small thing, but it is just another kind of string to the bow. What I would also say is that we're speaking in the week where the Scottish Government is kind of rolled back in some climate change targets, and that's quite pertinent because that comes as a result of the Climate Change Committee's recent report, which said they were unattainable. What was within that report? The fact that Scotland actually has to double its rate of woodland creation. And it's only going to do that. What a big part of that is going to be commercial forestry. A big part of that is going to be commercial plantations. So, or certainly that's one thing we can do. So, yeah, I think for people from a forestry perspective, when this happens, when these stories do happen, it's thinking, what arguments do we have? You're right. There's entrenched thinking. People are not going to change. Some people won't change their mind no matter what you did, but we have these tools here. We have pine martens that live in coniferous woodland as well. So anyway, there's all these things which we can maybe just use just to make a bit more of a case for well-managed, well-planted Sitka plantations, which are going to soak up a lot of carbon, which are going to give us a lot of timber, which we need, and are going to actually not necessarily be a blight on the environment.
Well, on the subject of Scotland's tree planting figures and the necessity of getting some big commercial interests involved, even though I have been off and I've not been following too much of the stories, I can't help but notice that Brewdog has been in the news lately with its the planting of its estate forest, the so-called Lost Forest, and hitting the headlines for, I think they would say, the wrong reasons. Is that right?
Yes, that would be right. And we should say this comes from initially was broken by Nick Kemper, I believe, on Park Watch Scotland, who did a lot of research into, did some FOIs, got the data and essentially found that, and you might have the exact number to hand, John, but I believe about 65% of the trees. That's about right. Anyway, a certainly significant number.
It was more than 50%. More than 50%. More than 50% of the planted trees have died since being planted. I think as many as 95% of the broadleaf these planted could be something like 65% of coniferous.
Yes, and we should say this particular woodland was a native woodland, so it's Scots pine that was made up the coniferous species.
Right. Yes. So quite a different mix of species, and one that's not been successful, and up to now, and quite a controversial project from the beginning. Yep. Obviously, Brewdog is very well known. If it had been perhaps another investor that had taken on that particular site, maybe it wouldn't have had as much attention from the likes of Parkwatch. But when Brewdog set out there to plant this forest, they did so in a very, very big, noisy way, saying, if you drink with us, you're drinking with a company that supports the climate, that is green, that is fighting climate change, that is doing all this. And I think that drew them a lot of attention from people who were perhaps sceptical about the involvement of commercial interests in forestry in the first place, about commercial enterprises being able to utilise forestry for their own PR campaigns, and were sceptical generally that they would be able to pull it off. And at this stage, it looks like they were perhaps right to be sceptical. I mean, it looks like a bit of a mess, to be frank, what's actually happened there.
Listen, you're always going to get loss on any plantation, no matter how well it's planted, no matter how well it's planned. It can be anything from deer to drought to anything like that. And I believe Brewdog have generally blamed the tough conditions over the last year for this particular high rate of loss. Now, people will have their own opinions on that, but yeah, you're always going to get a high rate of loss, and it's just coming at the time that we're in forestry with that RSE report with concerns over Sitka plantations elsewhere or coniferous plantations elsewhere. It probably was just the right time for a story like this that combines a lot of things that people maybe don't necessarily like or have reservations about. To put the two of them together, you've kind of got a powder keg, and I think you've seen that because the story's been everywhere. Yeah,
and it has been really interesting seeing which angle has been taken depending on who's reporting the actual story, isn't it? And what they're taking from the Brewdog story, what lessons they're taking. I mean, I've seen some people saying that this is obviously to be taken from this is that forestry grants should be scrapped. That the forestry grants system needs to be completely overhauled, that it doesn't work, and that this proves that. I don't know what other things you may have seen people say.
No, I think that generally is the kind of crux of the sort of big picture conclusion people have drawn from this story. And yeah, I mean, I would just point us back to that climate change committee conclusion that we're not planting enough and we need to double what we're planting, and those grants are key to that. Absolutely, I think there's a discussion to be had in the grant system, or people would argue there's a discussion to be had in the grant system, but the idea of getting rid of it and then expecting us still to make to get even close to what we need to plant, I think is it seems hard to imagine that would be the case. And people do talk about natural regen and so on, and again, totally, I think that there's a discussion to be had, and we've seen examples where that works, but we do have to plant on a scale in terms of the timber we need for building, in terms of the timber we need for other kind of projects, and are going to need in 30, 40, 50 years' time, and that's not all going to be possible because of natural regen, unfortunately.
Yeah, and certainly not if you leave your site open to deer browsing.
Let's move on to the next topic. I think that's probably a good sign of there. And I think maybe the last big topic we want to talk about today is, again, it concerns Scotland. There's a lot going on in Scotland right now.
There's a lot going on in Scotland.
There is. And it concerns this, and I'm going to use the word ban, but we'll get into that in a second. It concerns this ban on wood-burning stoves in new build homes and conversion projects in Scotland. Now, this is a story that kind of exploded out of nothing. In many ways, it was we were all late to the party on this. It was an architect in Oban, if I remember correctly, that kind of flagged everyone's attention to. And long story short, the building standard changed in Scotland and came into effect on the 1st of April. And what that meant is that, and I'm going to just kind of use broad terms here, so the correct terminology is on the website, but to use broad terms, that any new build property, any conversion after the 1st of April, that was applying for its licence after the 1st of April, had to come from a sort of an efficient and a climate-focused heat source. Now, that essentially ruled out the use of sort of biomass, it ruled out the use of wood burning.
What does it rule in?
Good
electricity?
Good question, John. That's a very good question. There's an exact term for it, which I don't have written down here from here, but it rules in a lot of different systems, which people do have concerns about because a lot of them come off the national grid, which is a kind of big discussion there. But I guess in terms of our own point of view, in terms of that actual that ban on wood burning stoves, now let's maybe get to that. I'm using the word ban. A lot of people in forestry have used the word ban. We've seen Andy Whiteman, who we'll get onto in a second, use the word ban. The Scottish Government initially, and when this story kind of broke and when everyone picked up on it, initially used the word ban itself. It said we're banning the sort of these archaic, again that's me paraphrasing, but we're banning these old systems, etc. As it's kind of spiralled, as it's kind of got out of control, they've now started to be very clear they're not banning wood burning stoves now. Technically that is correct. Technically you can still put in, and we're talking wood burning stoves, it does apply to anything that's in that category, but that's our bread and butter. Technically you can put in a wood burning stove still in a new build property in a conversion if you need it as an emergency heat source. Now, the thing there is they're not cheap to put in. We're talking by most estimates, we're talking between £5,000 and £10,000 to put this in, and that's maybe putting in something which you're not allowed to use as your main heat source, and you're not allowed to use all the time. So for the people that might necessarily need this, it's a big cost for something which they can maybe only use a couple of times a year or however often they need it.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly have. It is not uncommon in the wintertime for parts of rural Scotland to be hit by power outages, and for people to be very reliant on their wood burning stoves. Would they like to be going through those situations without them? And I don't know. It's and I know some people might say, well, these are new builds. Insulation in a new builds would mean that there's absolutely no requirement for anyone to have a wood burning stove in their home. But that requires quite a lot of certainty. And furthermore, a lot of the people that we know, because of the firewood explosion that we've seen in the market recently, has been down to mainly to the spiralling cost of gas and electricity. And if you're going to force people, in the future, down this route of only having those probably electricity most likely as an option, are you going to be making sure that it's affordable for them, as opposed to leaving and while still leaving people in rural parts with wood on their properties that they can't burn? It seems there's a lot of facets to this whole idea that I don't know.
Listen, I think some concerns over firewood are perfectly valid. The effects of the particulates in it, etc. These potentially are damaging. So I think that's fair enough. But that may be the case, and it might make sense then to ban it or to outlaw it in central Scotland and built up urban areas where that's not a concern. But we're talking about rural Scotland, where, as you say, this might be the only source someone can get. They're not going to spend 10 grand on a backup source. We also have the issues that a lot of the wood that gets used in firewood, it comes from small, sustainably managed woodland. And I've spoken to a few woodland owners and woodland managers who, since this is broken, are they're a bit worried, I think, quite frankly, what's going to happen to their income in the long term. And yes, there are concerns over biomass and we import a lot of the wood we actually import is for biomass to be burnt at power stations, and I think they're perfectly valid. Again, criticisms and complaints that people would have. But if you're talking about someone thinning a small woodland, crofters quite a lot of time, we're talking about someone thinning a small woodland, the wood then gets used sustainably, it goes to the local area, it gets used, and it's a kind of source that's there that can be used. It's hard to, I find it very hard to argue against that, and I think Andy Whiteman, we'll probably go back to him, has been quite good and articulate on this. People don't know, former Green MSP, member of the Forest Policy Group and forester by trade. He's been very good on this and essentially has argued that a blanket ban is just silly, and I think it probably is. And yes, I go back to exemptions are allowed, but it's not very clear what's going to be exempt. It's also not very clear that that's going to, as far as we understand, put the pressure on local councils to make the decision on what's exempt.
I think part of the concern comes from how it was announced. It did come about quite suddenly. People weren't aware of it. There doesn't seem to have been that much in the way of consultation or debate. And also, it points towards, is it the thin end of the wedge for firewood, for log burners. I mean, is this just the start of a move, of a purposeful move entirely away from that, which I think is a legitimate cause for concern?
Yep.
You know, people will say, it's new builds. Who worries about new builds? It's all fine. It's not going to affect, you know, the grannies in the Highlands who've been living in the same property for the last 60 years and rely on their. But it's like, not now. But what's going to come around the corner if
50 years, yeah.
I mean,
years.
as this stuff continues. So I think it is worth having a proper debate about, at least.
Yeah, and I think it'll be interesting to hear. We've got a few people writing things for us in the magazine for May's edition. It'll be very interesting to hear their thoughts on it because, as I say, I think I think those concerns about firewood and the potential dangers if it's in an urban environment are perfectly valid, but you know, rural Scotland and rural Britain as well, for that matter, but we're talking about Scotland, it's quite different. It's quite a different world we live in. And I think it may be worth pointing out, you mentioned about consultations. The government has pointed to the fact it held 2 consultations, but, they didn't get, it hardly had anyone, or as far as we know, basically no one in forestry. The only kind of organisation I could find that definitively belongs to forestry that replied to the consultation was Balcast Timber in Northern Ireland. So, that which obviously is a perfectly valid forestry voice, but it's one out of all. Where the firewood suppliers, where are the where's like Confor, FCA, etc., who probably would have wanted to say something on this. The Wood Heat Forum, as I believe they're now known, not the Wood, which was formerly the Wood Heat Association. All these players that would probably be able to present a genuinely good case for firewood there. Now, again, the government will point to this exemption, but until that's made a bit clearer, until that is not just a case of, spend 10 grand, get a backup, you can use it only as a backup. I think this is going to be a concern for many people.
And if you have any concerns that you want to share about any of the topics we've discussed today, not least what a meal we've made of discussing them, and you want to put us right on a few points, which we always welcome.
Yeah,
we always
this
welcome
is
feedback.
Totally. This is just supposed to be an off-the-cuff chat, guys. So if we have gotten points wrong, which you probably have, please just tell us when idiots, whatever.
Please do. Write in, tell us. editor@forestryjournal.co.uk is the email address, and we print what feedback we can in the magazine. We've got the latest issues of essentialARB and Forestry Journal there, you see. And you can continue to the debate that way, and of course down below in the comments section. But I think that'll do us for today. What's it?
Let's go. There's actually another car coming, so let's go before.
Okay. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you again. Today's sponsor has been Husqvarna. Check the link below to keep up to date with all that they're doing, and we will see you again on another forestry briefing next month.
See ya.